Hello, and welcome to this episode of Reading RPG Horror Stories. In this series, I'm going to be reading some RPG horror stories while playing RPGs that I very much enjoy. Today's game is Disco Elysium, and I'm going to be talking about user Storytime42's post on RPG horror stories titled Ask 3 Questions, Get Kicked. Now, before we get into this post, I'd like to lay out a couple of ground rules about what we're going to be talking about. This user describes being in an OSR game, and for anybody who doesn't know what an OSR game is, it's a type of role-playing game where rulings are prioritized over rules. OSR stands for Old School Renaissance or Old School Revival. It's generally found in older RPG systems, so your Classic D&D, your AD&D, and 3.5e. Now, this does not limit OSR games to just D&D. There are other systems that count as OSR systems. When people reference OSR games, they usually also reference Matt Finch's book, Primer of Old School Gaming. In OSR games, you'll usually find more character-driven moments and less narrative-driven moments that might feel more artificial. All this to say, an OSR game does not work if the group's chemistry is not good. And we're going to find from this post that this group does not have good chemistry. With that out of the way, let's start getting into user Storytime42's Ask 3 Questions, Get Kicked. They open by saying, "This is probably tame for this subreddit, and the fallout wasn't soul-crushing. But we all have that one experience that seems to needle in your subconscious. For me, it was joining an OSR game. Despite my older age, I have not played 1st or 2nd edition D&D, but GM sent me a link to the rules he was using. I got to ask the GM a total of 3 questions. Let's stop the post right here. It is a major red flag to be limiting the amount of questions that your players can have for you, especially in a small group setting. I don't even know what the DM wanted the response to be. Oh yes, I know my place below you, so I'll only ask you 3 questions like you're a genie or something. It's bonkers. Especially because this is this person's first OSR game. And I don't know about you, but tabletop RPGs are not very intuitive systems, especially the older ones. With that rant out of the way, let's get back to the post. They continue, "I had a question about the spellcasting. I asked him some questions on the specific mechanics I was reading. His reply was that my question didn't make sense and it was just normal spellcasting. I said, it's okay, I could play an archer character instead. I asked him that since he was playing from older editions, is he using older elven D&D lore? Specifically being reincarnated and their trans streams being old memories. He said no and that it was fine. No worries, I said. Since in the Discord channel there was discussion of someone else not being able to start on the expected day and wanted a week later start date, I asked 2 days before the original start day if we were still on track to start on original date. Looking for a confirmation. No response. Just blocked. Removed from the Discord, which was a community, not just for his private games. Blocked from private messages, no explanation." Taking a break from the post for a second. As a DM, it is so baffling to me this behavior happens. The limiting of someone's questions, that's already something that I don't like, I don't think is good, I don't think it contributes to a healthy session. And then after that, to not tell someone about those limits and then block them as soon as they go over it, that is wild, that is crazy, that is bonkers behavior. All this kind of DMing does is beget another line of people who are going to DM like this that think this is the way that you play D&D, and that's really unhealthy for a group of people who are trying to play a game. Because at the end of the day, D&D is about fun. It's about playing a game, it's about having fun with your friends. It is not about being above your friends, it is not about being an unquestioned authority to your friends. And if you're not playing with your friends, make them your friends. You can be friendly towards people. Alrighty, let's get back to the post. It does get better from here. They go onward to say, "Found out later from a friend still on the Discord, the GM went through a tirade about how much I was pestering him. How I wanted special treatment. That this period is a time in which he is still deciding on who gets to play in his game. that he had a discussion with me privately, which he did not, and we decided it was best that I leave. Unilaterally, his choice. My friend, after seeing the private messages to and from the GM, decided this guy was a tool and it best to keep his distance. They conclude by saying, "I know I dodged a bullet, but I was really excited to try old school D&D. P.S. I've since filled that spot in my schedule with an excellent 5e game." End of post. Now, it's always bad to hear about a bad game of D&D. I always feel bad for people whenever I see somebody who's been through a bad game, whether it be through a bad player, unexperienced DMs, what have you. It sucks to play in a bad D&D game. Now, there's maliciously bad and there's happenstance bad, in my opinion. And this, I think, was maliciously bad. You can tell that this DM is highly suited towards an Iron Fist style of playing. Now, I think that this person might benefit from being a writer rather than a DM, because it sounds like this person just cannot take player input. And I think that as a DM, that is such a detriment to have. And while I do believe that he is a bad DM, I don't believe this person should be demonized, nor should most bad DMs. I think that this is something where you leave the game, you recognize it was a bad game, and if at some point this DM decides to reach out, apologize, and run a better game, you could rejoin if you wanted to. Now, there are situations where there are awful circumstances, either begat by the DM, by other players, or any other number of things, where it's not a good idea to come back, but I think that this could be salvageable. At least that's what I would say if there wasn't that tirade at the end about how much this player was pestering and annoying him. I think that has no place in a group that you're trying to have a game with. You should not be talking about your players or anybody else in this group like that with the rest of your group. You shouldn't be talking about these people like that in general. And I think this person talking about those people in that way shows a large amount of immaturity and a large amount of growth that needs to be done before this person could be redeemed as a DM. This interaction was marked by a great lack of professionalism and a great lack of emotional intelligence on the DM's part. I'm very glad that OP was able to get out of this game and not have to realize that later down the line when it might be a little bit too late to leave. I've seen many posts where somebody has a great start with a group, gets really deeply ingrained into it, and then that guy rears his ugly head. And staying on the subject of that guy, I'd like to take us to our next post. This comes from a deleted user on RPG Horror Stories. This set of posts really details how that guy can affect a group of D&D players to the point of even becoming a problem player example that they use later on to show new players. And I think that's the best thing you can do with the problem player is cut them out and use them as an example for people later on to show them what you don't like in a group. With the introduction out of the way, let's get into the post. They open by saying, "I have a lot of stories regarding a consistent that guy we were finally able to get rid of our friend group circle from around 2 or 3 years ago. I just want to tell a few of which I remember off the top of my head." And taking a brief pause from the post, this first story showcases a very egregious behavior from that guy. He even goes to the point of being ableist. I would like to give that warning to anybody listening, just in case that's something you're not comfortable. Now that that's out of the way, I'd like to introduce the first story of this anthology, The Slow Elf Situation. He opens by saying, "So, I was running a campaign where the idea was it was a mix of SCP and common fantasy tropes. The world had a secret organization known as the Zion, who tried to keep the concept of magic and strange otherworldly entities a secret, out of a sort of fear of what they could do. One of the party members was an elf bard that was raised by one of these SCP-like entities in the woods, a sort of fae-like creature. At one point, the party actually found an NPC related to the creature raised by this entity, a sort of leprechaun-like fellow who was trying to give exposition to the player. I'd like to take a pause here to talk about this setting. I think this setting is so cool, and it really showcases OP's creativity. I think it's really cool to be able to take a bunch of things that you like, mesh them together into something that's unique and you. I think that's awesome. I think everybody should try and create something like that. Not exactly a D&D world or anything that has to do with TTRPGs in general, just something that you like that's an amalgamation of things that you like. I think that's really magic that they were able to do this. Now let's get back to the post. OP goes on to state, "The first thing to note about that guy, who I shall call TG from now on, is that he had a major inferiority complex. If there was any situation he was not the biggest Chad in the room, with the spotlight on him, he'd take that spotlight and tape it to his head." Let's take another break from the post. I'm sure anybody who has played D&D, at some point or another you've come across someone like this. Now, most of the time, it's a new player, and you can teach them to not act like this. But as we'll see with that guy, this is a behavior he's deeply ingrained in, and it's something he's not planning on stopping for a very long time. And that's why this kind of behavior becomes dangerous, is when it becomes normal. If any of you listening have this kind of that guy at your table, you need to have a serious talk with them about your expectations of your game. With that out of the way, let's get back to the post. OP continues. "In this situation, he'd constantly talk over the other player this NPC was built for, and at one point told the leprechaun that he should not worry about the elf because she was mentally slurred." Whoa there, let's take another pause from the post. It is wild to be talking about a character like this, especially a player character, someone else at your table. Like, I don't know if this elf bard slighted that guy in some way, but even if that is the case, this is completely uncalled for and highly inappropriate. If you're playing D&D and you're jealous that someone else is getting the spotlight, the best thing you can do is be happy for their character. Be happy that there's development going on, and wait your turn for your own character moment. Because D&D games are long. You're going to have a character moment if you just wait. Now that the rant's done, let's get back to the post. Something to note is that we don't allow that word in our group, and we have friends that have negative histories with the word, and he had had several warnings regarding the word before. I did not do anything besides scold him for using the word, but in hindsight, I probably should have server muted him on Discord, then had the leprechaun cast hold person on him or something. End of the first story. I cannot agree more with OP. He definitely should have at least muted this guy, if not kicked him from this group for that infraction. Especially if it's something he had issues with before. I know for my group and for many other groups, it's one and done with these types of infractions, because that shows an immense lack of respect for the people that you're playing with, and that's something that cannot continue in a game that's trying to go long term. Like, imagine being in a group where one person is being such a problematic player and such a problematic friend that they have to be told multiple times to not use slurs. And it's not even not using slurs in general, it's not using slurs to other people in that friend group. It's insane behavior, and it's not sustainable. And it really makes me wonder what that guy's thought process is. It's probably something along the lines of, "This person gets to be the main character. Guess they're R-slurred." And it's like, calm down, bud. Go have your apple juice, go sit in the corner, go think about what you did for the rest of the session. We'll decide if we want you back. And I don't know about you, but it would be really hard for me to let somebody like that back into my friend group. This next story is titled, "The Worst Artificer Ever." And this is set back in the days when UA Artificer had come out. And if you don't know anything about UA Artificer, it's a gem. Is it necessarily a good D&D class? No. Is it even a whole lot of fun to play? Not always. But it's so interesting. Now, throughout D&D's run, there's been a set of supplemental playtest materials called Unearthed Arcana. This specific class came out in January 2017. So we're talking Wizards of the Coast 5e stuff. And UA Artificer is pretty close to a gunslinger from Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or even a inventor from Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's pretty much marked by the use of guns, the use of magic items, and the infusion of magic into items. Overall, UA is a really fun class. It's not super balanced, but we also have UA to thank for Mystics, so there's that. And another thing to explain is that Unearthed Arcana is in no way base book. It's not exactly homebrew, but it's not exactly base book either. It is playtest material. That being said, plenty of DMs love to use Unearthed Arcana. I am one of them. I love being able to have material that isn't in the books, or even material that runs a little differently from the stuff that ends up being in the books. That being said, we're about to see that guy make his own homebrew version of the Unearthed Arcana version of the Artificer. And we'll come to find out that that guy is not very good at homebrew. Explanation out of the way, let's get into the post. This is The Worst Artificer Ever, the second story of this anthology. Another big habit of TG's was making very poorly balanced homebrews. I should mention at the time of this story, UA Artificer had come out, and I was looking to play an Artificer-like character, but TG had a problem with the UA Artificer, so he made a homebrew version of his own creation and forced me to use it. The problem? It was completely unfinished and unpolished, to the point where I had not once actually crafted anything of use, and the few times where I wanted to, I was told that I could not. This was also a time when I did not fully understand balanced homebrew, and with how much he had done in the past, I was sort of subconsciously convinced that he knew what he was talking about or doing. But I was wrong, as he had not even written down the rules for making magic items as an artificer, so I just sort of asked, "Can I make this?" To which the answer was usually no. That game did not last longer than 5 sessions or so. End of post. And forgive me when I say, it's not very shocking that this game didn't last much longer than 5 sessions. You can really tell that guy thinks he's hot shit, and that's something I just don't like having at the table. Especially because he didn't even write down the rules for making items as an artificer. That is one of the things that they do. That's like what defines the artificer class. If you take away the creation of things from an artificer, you have an Eldritch Knight fighter with a gun. And if I wanted to play an Eldritch Knight fighter with a gun and reshuffled spell list, I would just homebrew that. Because not very many things make the UA Artificer fun, but that's one of them, is that you get to create items, you get to create magic items, you get to do all kinds of cool stuff like that, and taking that away just makes the class less fun, and I don't know why you would want to make D&D less fun. And it's definitely not the case that D&D is a competition and that you need to be good at it, but that guy is not good at D&D. He's very, very bad at it, and he just seems like someone I would definitely not want to have at my table, or even in my friend group as somebody outside my table. Next up, I'm going to read a story called I'm the Coolest Monk, the last story of this anthology. OP opens by stating, "This combines 2 of TG's biggest habits, poorly balanced homebrews and overly edgy characters. In this situation, TG made a monk homebrew and created a character who was sort of an interdimensional traveler from Limbo who held near godlike power, but only when his emotions took over. The problem, obviously, is that you can't reliably be a godlike being at level 1, so he sort of socially manipulated the DM to let him be this powerful while also making one of the most unbalanced homebrews I've ever seen, to the point where the events that transpired were actually the events that led us to kicking him out of the group." Let's take a break from the post. So this kind of reminds me of when I first started D&D and what one of my friends in that group would do whenever it was time for character creation. Now, this guy always had to be the most powerful character. He always had to have all the coolest stuff. He always had to have the most interesting backstory. I'm sure you know the type. We're talking about it in this post, even. This guy's go-to was always an angel-demon hybrid, who was also a vampire, called Alucard. Real original, I know. And whenever Alucard got into a fight, he would win. Whether it was through actual good rolls, fudged good rolls, throwing a fit until he won, what have you, he would always win. And what this did was create a very unfun game for literally everyone, including this player. Because once you take the challenge out of the game, it is no longer fun and it's no longer a game. It's just saying that you win a bunch of times. And so, as a DM, it got to the point where I would just say, no, you lose. And this guy lost a lot of characters to that, because if you're going to bullshit on your end, I will too as a DM. And that's an approach I see a lot of DMs having with problem players, and it's not something I do anymore, but it's definitely something I used to do, and I am inclined to doing it to this day. But now I hold the belief more so that bullshit begets bullshit, and if you foster a game like this, then you're only ever going to make D&D less fun for people, because you're focusing on the problem player too much. So the best advice I can give for anybody dealing with a player like this, where they always have to win and they always have the coolest character, honestly, just cut them out of the game for at least a session. Let them sit out, ask them what they want from the game, ask everybody else what they want from the game, and see if that coincides. And if it doesn't, you don't need that player. Like I've said before, and like I'll say again, no D&D is way better than bad D&D. And the same rings true for any other game. It's not just tabletop RPGs, and it's not just D&D. You shouldn't be playing games with somebody who doesn't respect you and who doesn't feel like you're as equal as they are. All that being said, let's get back to the post. Basically, his homebrew monk was so unbalanced that it led us to do the math, and at max level with no magic items, his monk could actually do enough damage to kill 3 Tarrasques. My DM went out of her way to make a full-on 34-page long analysis of his homebrew when compared against the other monk or martial subclass builds, and his trumped all of them. We then sent this document to him and made some suggestions on how to fix it. He had a big fit, and then we just kicked him out afterwards. TG is now an example to our group of what type of player we no longer allow in our games, and now a lot of our games are tons of fun. Whenever I make homebrew, now I think, alright, what can I do that's not an OP monk? End of post. And honestly, I think that's the best thing that OP could have done here, is just cut him out of the game, have a better game without him, and choose to play better games in the future. Use him as an example for what kind of player you're not going to allow. And next I'd like to read you the first entry of a new anthology on RPG horror stories given by user the Emo Oni. I'm going to call this saga The Problem Players of the Apocalypse. Here's part 1. OP opens by saying, "This is part 1 of a 5-part series. The first 4 parts are about each of the problem players, and the 5th part about how they ended the private server I was a part of, causing a massive war in character and out of character that ended in an amazing place." I'd like to take a brief break from this post just to highlight just how problematic this kind of player is, especially because there's a new player in this group. And I just feel so bad for this person that this is one of their first ever games. The specific kind of problem player we're dealing with in this episode is a murder hobo. And if you don't know what a murder hobo is, it's basically your D&D player that tries to have a combat with anything and everything he possibly can. The kind of player where it's only fun if you're always fighting, and there's no room for any kind of roleplay, or at least any kind of meaningful roleplay. And to have a tabletop RPG without any meaningful roleplay is almost not having a tabletop RPG at all. Like, if you want to have a game like this, play Vermintide 2. Play something that you're going to have fun with, because this just makes it less fun for everyone at the table. Overall, it's just really sad for me to see someone whose first interaction with D&D is marked by such a bad player. And we're gonna see just how bad this player is. Let's get back into the post. This is part 1 of Problem Players of the Apocalypse by the Emo Oni on RPG Horror Stories. This one is about the first of the problem players, Murder Hobo, but let's just call them Hobo. Hobo may be the problem player I despise the least, and we had personal beef, so get ready to see how bad the others are. People of relevance. Me, playing a Goron fighter in Dumble's campaign, one of the players who founded the server. Dumble, great DM and moderator, narrated a great campaign on the Eventidian Islands. Hobo, first problem player, played a Sheikah Artificer and later on a Zora Wizard. Tyler, new person, played as a Deku fighter and was victim of Hobo's shenanigans. Majora, one of the 3 admins on the server, strict but fair. Our server was a pretty big private server in a Legend of Zelda homebrewed setting with a lot of changes. I mostly helped design some new lore in the Satori race. It was some time ago, more than a year ago, when on June 25th, Dumble wanted to start a campaign to reward someone with the Triforce Piece of Courage. Triforce pieces were given on very few occasions, the Piece of Power being given on a campaign that was about the massive pirate invasion DM'd by the owner of the server, and the Piece of Wisdom was given away at the biggest campaign of the server, hosting 10 players and being DM'd by Majora and Dumble combined. We could only guess that this was to celebrate the completion of the server lore about the Deaths in the Sky Islands after the Tears of the Kingdom released. I'd like to take a pause here to talk about this setting. I think that D&D and Zelda can mesh very, very well if you're good at homebrew. Zelda is something I and many other people who play D&D have always loved. It's just great. It's got great puzzles, it's got great world building, you name it, it's a great series. And it's got some really deep lore. Like, if you go into any game, you're gonna find a bunch of story. As we get into this story, we're going to see just how deep these people's love for Zelda goes. And it's just really sad to see that we have a new player in such a cool setting and such a bad problem player. You're going to see just how bad it gets. Let's get back into the post. Dumble didn't say much, except that this was supposed to be a prequel to the Totke campaign, which will be equal in scale to the Botwa campaign, the aforementioned 10-player campaign. Both me and Hobo joined in. We both wanted the Triforce Piece of Courage for our PCs, and Tyler joined because it would be their first ever campaign in all of D&D, so we wanted to give them a great experience. A lot of other people didn't join because they either weren't interested or busy with things outside the server. OP continues. We started the campaign in a Session 0 at Lurelin, where a boat got sent to the Eventidian Isles and got caught in a storm, sending us to a random island. This is where our characters worked together with the crew of the ship in the first few sessions to get the ship seaworthy again. It took some effort, killing a demon and some good dice rolls, but we did. Unfortunately, we got caught in yet another storm and faced our BBEG for the first time, one of the Archdemons. Their creatures are often used as BBEGs. You can think about Girahim, he's the most powerful Archdemon. I'd like to take another break from the post. This is looking like it's going to be a great first campaign for Tyler already. You've got a lot of character moments, you've got some good plot points, and we're on a quest to get one of the biggest artifacts in the Zelda world. Not to mention the fact that they've already done some fights together. This is not Session 1 that the problem starts. And I think this could have been a great campaign if it weren't for Hobo. And we're gonna see just how Hobo decides to be a problem. Like I said earlier, D&D is not a game that it matters if you're good or bad at it, but we're going to see that Hobo is very bad at it. He's very bad at roleplay, and he's not very good at keeping a character. At least a character that's likable or doesn't attack everything he sees. And as we saw with that guy in the previous post, Hobo has a serious case of main character syndrome. And main character syndrome is something I unfortunately see a lot of players having. That doesn't mean it can't be redeemed, it's just something that a lot of players start out with. And I think it's something that if you learn early on, you can become a good player. But as we see with Hobo and that guy, when you double down on it, that's when you start to become a problem player. If you find yourself seething at other players' character moments, you can just keep in mind that if you wait, you will have your own. Like I said before, D&D games are long, and you are going to have a character moment given enough time. But if you just make your character into someone who attacks everything for attention, you're only ever making the game worse for other people that want to roleplay. That's not to say that murder hobo campaigns aren't fun or that they can't happen, but that's something that the whole group decides on. It's very different from being a problem player in this way. I have ran and played in many great villain campaigns where you're allowed to just go and mess with people and do awful things if you want to, but that was the point of the campaign, is to go and be a bad guy. That's not the point of this Zelda campaign where you're trying to be virtuous and get this artifact. And as we're gonna see from Murder Hobo, he's just not a good friend or a good player to have around. We're even gonna go on to see him incite PvP with the new player, and that's something I don't like. I always think it's a red flag for a player to be inciting PvP with another player if it's not in good faith. I think that two players can agree on PvP as long as it's non-lethal, because that can be fun. It can be really fun to play a PvP style fight with another one of your party members. That can be a great part of a session that maybe leads to character moments. But this is not what Hobo is trying to do. Rant out of the way, let's get back to the post. OP continues by saying, Dumble. Standing at the front of your ship, a scaled creature reminiscent of Azora stood. They looked like a kraken subspecies with purple skin and yellow glowing eyes. Their arms are covered in huge scars and are holding a chain in both hands, and one end holding an anchor. Hobo. I attack it and use magnesis to throw one of my metal bullets at it. We all looked horrified as Dumble began describing how the creature caught it with one hand. A valiant attempt. You amuse me, Sheikah. It was clear that Dumble didn't want Hobo's dumbassery to kill all of us, because everyone except our problem player knew that we were not equipped to fight an Archdemon at this point. We quickly told Hobo in character that we were too weak and that we needed to do something else, until Dumble interrupted our talk, announcing the arrival of another Zora who seemed to emit power like only a deity could. Tyler's character, who knew a thing or two about the pantheon of Zora, quickly recognized her as Selene, goddess of the ocean, the Zeus of the Zora pantheon. The demon crawled away in fear of the deity, and we discovered its name was Bellum. Woo! Wind Waker sequel reference. Selene blessed our ship with a force field, making sure that Bellum or its demon henchmen wouldn't enter the boat, but regular monsters still could. A couple of sessions later, the drama really began. Dumble began praising Tyler out of character because of their skill of role-playing, great personality, and quick grasp with the rules. And to be honest, they deserved it, but Hobo thought differently about that, fearing that the newbie would get the Triforce piece instead of them, so they made an agreement for a PvP match. And whoever won would get disqualified from getting the Triforce piece. What in character was a regular sparring match was out of character a battle for deciding who got a chance to get one of the most powerful artifacts and who wouldn't. Let's take a brief pause from the post. This behavior is sadly very common among problem players, especially murder hobos. The idea that if I can't have X cool thing, then no one can have X cool thing, or at least this person can't have X cool thing. When, like I've said before, all that does is make the game less fun for other people playing. And it'll even make it less fun for yourself because you're making yourself hung up over other people getting cool things. Especially if you're getting hung up to the point of inciting PvP over an in-game item. Like I said, PvP can be cool and it can lead to some cool character moments. I just think it should never end in player death. And I have a slight problem with the DM of the campaign because of how this was handled. I think that allowing PvP is fine, and I think that, again, it can lead to some cool character moments, but I think the second that mortal damage is dealt from one player to another player in PvP is where the line needs to be drawn. And even if you do want to finish the fight with one character being knocked out, I don't think that a PvP fight should end in player character death. I feel like all that does is drive a wedge between players. But we'll see that Hobo has no issue killing another player character. That out of the way, let's get back to the post. OP continues. It wasn't even close. Sheikah mostly get their advantage from teleportation and the sneak attack combo, which didn't work in a sparring match, especially not a sparring match against someone who fought alongside you for some time. While Tyler's player character was specialized for upfront fighting as a fighter and had acquired a Deku staff made from the branch of the Deku tree having magical powers. To make the story short, Hobo lost and Tyler won. After that I asked Dumble if they would also disqualify me from getting the Triforce piece, meaning that the only candidate left for it was Tyler, and they clearly were capable of handling such a responsibility both in and out of character. What Hobo did was just idiotic. They knew damn well what their player character could and couldn't do, and they knew they were at a disadvantage starting with this sparring match. They knew the chances of winning were low, so they had no real justification for their later acts in my point of view. They just wanted their shot. And that's where I'm gonna cut today's post for this episode. Stay tuned for part 2, where we're gonna see Murder Hobo throw the biggest fit we've seen yet from him. And I'm not talking just small disagreements, I'm talking a full-on conniption. Because as we've seen with problem players in the past, and as we'll continue to see with problem players, it's never just one issue, it's compounding. I hope this has been both informative and entertaining for people playing D&D, people not playing D&D, people studying, anything. Honestly, it means a lot to me that this video is watched. So, thank you for watching. Let me know if there's any stories you'd like me to cover in the future. And whatever you happen to be doing while watching this video, you're doing a great job. So again, thank you for watching. Stay tuned for part 2, where we're gonna see the worst from Murder Hobo. And with all that out of the way, I'm out of here.
Thank you.